So I guess if the proposal was on the table then, it was on the table legislated as recent as the last government. Why are you now going so far back on what's been mooted in tax reform for almost a generation?
Well, first of all, the changes that were proposed by Scott Morrison 5 years ago were not consistent with the example you're raising from 16 years before. What we're talking about here is an opportunity to deliver around the same amount of tax relief as was proposed 5 years ago, but in a far superior way. More relief for people and better reform for the economy. I don't think anybody expects that a Labor government, after a GFC and a pandemic, an inflation spike, interest rate rises, and all the pressures that people confront in 2024, I don't think people expect their highest priority to implement some direction that was indicated 16 years before that.
Is it not true, though, that Australians generally pay too much income tax?
Well, we're trying to give more people a tax cut. We're trying to get average tax rates down in this budget and this economy. And what we need to recognise here is that there is more than one way to return bracket creep, and there's more than one way to reform the tax system. And the reason why ours is a superior tax reform and a superior economic reform is we're dropping 2 rates and we're lifting 2 thresholds, and that's because we're dealing with bracket creep where it has the most impact, and that's in Middle Australia. And I think the policy itself has been largely uncontested by our opponents because their position is indefensible and unsustainable. Now, Susan Lee says they will absolutely unwind these changes. That's their position. That's the only definitive position that they've taken on these tax cuts. That's a recipe for higher taxes for Middle Australia.
Do you think Peter Dutton should come out this week with his stance when he said it won't be this week?
Of course he should. You know, I say to Peter Dutton, get out of the way of a tax cut for the early educators and steel workers and nurses and truckies of this country. You can't be for Middle Australia and against Labor's bigger tax cuts for Middle Australia. They have to choose. As usual, he will play his typical mindless and nasty negative politics, and that's because his position on the substance of this, as articulated by Susan Lee, is indefensible and unsustainable. And you see from the figures released today in their own communities, they are diabolically out of touch with Middle Australia and with their own communities. The communities that they are supposed to represent stand to be among the biggest beneficiaries of what we are proposing here. So they are putting politics before the people that they are supposed to represent, and I think that they should change course because there's an opportunity here to do the right thing by people instead of playing Peter Dutton's usual nasty, negative, mindless political games.
Treasury Jim has told Japanese business figures that Australia will remain a very strong supporter of the gas export industry for many years to come. How does that square with Australia's climate change ambitions?
Well, we've made it very clear. I've made it clear, Madeline has, Foreign Minister, Trade Minister, Prime Minister, to our Japanese friends and other friends in the region, that we intend to continue.
OK, that's why we leave Jim Chalmers, a substantive focus of that media conference being tax cuts, of course, describing what the coalition put forward in stage 3 tax cuts as indefensible and unsustainable. So that's a step forward there from Jim Chalmers on the architecture put forward and legislated by Parliament under the previous government. Where the coalition goes here, well, we spoke to Jane Hume last hour. They're keeping their cards pretty close to their chest. They're trying to inflict maximum political damage here. But the question is, will the coalition really stand in Parliament and stand in the way of a tax cut for 13 million people when Parliament does resume? Because the difference is Labor's plan, well, that is to come into effect in July of this year. Dunkley, of course, will be a good litmus test where Jim Chalmers is this morning.